In this video for section 1.5, we're going to see our method for solving quadratic equations, and that's the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is a formula. We plug in the coefficients of x squared, x, and the constant, a, b, and c, and the quadratic formula gives us the values for x. Now, the plugging in is usually the easy part here. The difficult part is the simplifying, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So, when we're using the quadratic formula, our first step is to identify a, b, and c, and then we can start plugging in. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b, so that's negative 2, plus or minus square root of b squared, 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 8, times c, which is negative 1. If there's a negative sign in front, make sure that you include that when plugging in. And that is all over 2 times a, which is 8. Now to simplify. Now, the easiest way to do it, I think, is to start with what's under the square root and break it up into steps. So we have negative 2 plus or minus 2 squared is 4, and then we have negative 4 times 8 times negative 1. Now, this is the first spot where it can be a little bit tricky. This is a minus, and then even though this 1 is at the end, this minus negative is going to change to plus. So it's going to be plus 4 times 8 times 1. 4 times 8 times 1 is 32, so plus 32. So that's the first thing that you want to watch out for. And then when I add those together, 4 plus 32 is 36. Now, once you get to this step, sometimes in the problem, you're going to be done. And if this number under the square root was a number that you could not simplify, say if it was square root of 35, I can't simplify that. It's not a perfect square, and it can't be divided by any numbers that are perfect squares. So if that were the case, I would just be done. However, if it's something that can be simplified, or if it's a perfect square, then you can keep going. So 36 in this case is a perfect square. So it's 6. So I'm going to take the square root, and then I have over 16. Now, if the number was a perfect square and you take the square root, then the square root symbol goes away. And what you need to do next is write this as two separate fractions and then simplify each. So the first one I'm going to do is negative 2 plus 6 over 16. And then the second one is negative 2 minus 6 over 16. So like I mentioned in the last video, if you have whole numbers, MyLab Math doesn't really like it if you use the plus or minus symbol. It's okay if you have a square root, because if it were like negative 2 plus square root of 6, I can't combine those together. However, if they both are whole numbers, then you can just do the addition and subtraction, and MyLab Math is going to want you to do that. So negative 2 plus 6 is 4, and then they also are going to want you to simplify fractions whenever possible. So I can simplify that to 1/4. Negative 2 minus 6 is negative 8, and negative 8 over 16, I can simplify that to negative 1/2. So my solution set that I put in the bracket is 1/4, comma, negative 1/2. And again, they're generally going to prefer you to write things as fractions instead of decimals. So, next you should try checkpoint problem number 6. Do this in your notes, check your answer, and then move on with the rest of the video. So next we're going to look at example 7, and this is another one where we're solving using the quadratic formula. So I first want to identify my variables, and then I'm going to plug in. So we have negative b. Now this is another place where you can make a mistake. So if b itself is negative, this is going to be negative, -6, and that's going to change to plus. So pay attention to the sign on b when you're plugging that in. Then we have the plus minus, square root, -6 squared. Again, paying attention to signs, that's going to be positive 36. -4 times a is 2, and times c, which is positive 1. And all that over 2 times a, which is 2. So let's simplify. Positive 6 plus or minus square root of 36 minus 4 times 2 times 1 is 8. And that's divided by 4. And 36 minus 8 is 28. Now, once we have that square root down to a single number, this is where we look at, is it a perfect square, or is it something that can be simplified? 28 is not a perfect square. However, it can be divided by 4. 4 times 7 is 28, and that means that it can be simplified. So I know that 28 is 4 times 7. I'm just going to keep the other stuff here for right now, the 6 and the 4. So this is going to be 6 plus or minus, square root of 4 is 2, and 7 stays under the square root. This is why we talked about simplifying square roots back in week 1. Now, once you get it simplified, sometimes you're going to be done at this step. However, the next thing that you need to look at is look at these 3 numbers, the 6, the 2, and the 4. Not the number under the square root, but do these 3 numbers have any factors in common? If so, then you need to factor it out and you can simplify. So I can take out a 2 from all of those numbers. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So this is going to be 3 plus or minus 1 times square root of 7, which I can just write that as 7, over 2. But this is going to be my answer, and so this is what I would type into the squiggly bracket in the homework. So next you should look at checkpoint problem number 7. Do this in your notes, check your answer, and then move on with the video. The last example that we're going to look at is example 8, and this is another solve using the quadratic formula. So we're going to start with labeling A, B, and C and then plugging in. The simplifying on this one is going to be a little bit different, which is why we're doing this example. So starting with negative B, that's negative 2. So changes to plus or minus, square root of -2 squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. A is 3. So we have 2 plus or minus the square root of -2 squared is 4, and 4 times 3 times 4 is 12 times 4, which is minus 48. All over 6. And 4 minus 48 is negative 44. So here we are at that simplifying step. Now, one thing about simplifying, if the square root is the square root of a negative number, then you always need to write it with the I. So at minimum, whatever number this is, if there's a negative sign, I need to put an I in front of the square root. So for this one, not only is it that there's a square root of a negative number, but the number itself can be simplified. So if it's a perfect square, like if this were square root of negative 49, I would need to write that as 7i. If it's a square root of a number that's not a perfect square, but something that can be divided by a perfect square, then I need to do that simplification. If neither is the case, like say if it were 43, then I would just write I square root of 43 and I would be done. But with this one, we have to simplify square root of negative 44 because 44 is 4 times 11, and 4 is a perfect square. So when I do my simplifying, we have 2 plus or minus, this is going to be 2i square root of 11 over 6. Now, once I get to this step, I'm looking at the three numbers, not the number under the square root, but the three numbers, and saying, okay, is there anything that I can take out of all three numbers? Yes, they can all be divided by 2. So this is going to become 1, this is going to become 1, this is going to become 3. So my final answer that MyLab Math is looking for is 1 plus or minus I square root of 11 over 3. If you have a 1, again, multiplied by anything, you don't need to write it. So this 1i square root of 11, I can drop the 1. This 1 I cannot drop because it's 1 added to something, and that does make a difference. So 1 plus or minus, I still need to have that first 1 in there. So look at checkpoint problem number 8, check your answer, and then you can move on to the homework for this section.